The radar picket destroyer USS Maynard L. Able was stationed 65 nautical miles northwest of Okinawa on April 12, 1945, when radarman second-class Tommy Morrison first detected the incoming formation of Japanese aircraft on his SG surface search radar. The green phosphorescent blips appeared as tiny dots of light moving across the circular scope at bearing 325 degrees, range 42 miles, closing at an estimated speed of 180 knots toward the solitary American warship that had been assigned to provide early warning for Task Force 58's fast carrier groups operating in support of the Okinawa invasion. Morrison's trained eye immediately recognized the tactical significance of what he was observing through the rubber eyepiece of his radar equipment. 6 aircraft flying in tight formation at low altitude, maintaining radio silence, approaching from the direction of Japanese airfields on Kyushu Island, could mean only one thing. Another kamikaze attack was beginning. Morrison's voice carried the controlled urgency of a veteran radar operator who had spent the past 3 months tracking suicide aircraft toward American naval formations, as he announced the contact over the ship's general announcing system. Bridge, Combat Information Center. Multiple bogeys bearing 325 degrees, range for 0 miles, closing fast. Count 6 aircraft in formation, altitude estimated 500 feet, speed 180 knots. The announcement triggered immediate action throughout the 2,200-ton Fletcher-class destroyer, as her crew of 273 officers and enlisted men prepared for what had become the most terrifying experience in modern naval warfare, defending against Japanese pilots who had dedicated their lives to sinking American ships through suicide attacks. Captain Alexis de Grasse, commanding officer of the USS Maynard L. Able, received Morrison's radar contact report while standing on the destroyer's bridge wing, scanning the western horizon through his binoculars for visual confirmation of the approaching threat. The 34-year-old Naval Academy graduate had commanded the destroyer since her commissioning in July 1944, leading her through 9 months of combat operations in the Pacific theater that had included the Philippines campaign, Iwo Jima invasion, and now the protracted battle for Okinawa. De Grasse understood that his ship's position as a radar picket vessel made her a prime target for kamikaze attacks, but he also knew that the early warning provided by radar picket destroyers was essential for protecting the main body of American naval forces supporting the Okinawa operation. The tactical situation facing the USS Maynard L. Able reflected the broader strategic realities of the Okinawa campaign, where Japanese forces had adopted systematic suicide tactics designed to inflict maximum casualties on American naval forces through coordinated kamikaze attacks, known as Kikusui operations. The destroyer was operating alone on Radar Picket Station 14, positioned to provide early warning of Japanese air attacks while lacking the concentrated anti-aircraft firepower available to ships operating in formation with other vessels. Her armament consisted of 5 5-inch/38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 6 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, and 10 20mm Oerlikon cannons, formidable firepower against conventional air attacks but potentially insufficient against multiple suicide aircraft attacking simultaneously from different directions. Morrison's radar tracking revealed that the Japanese formation was following standard kamikaze approach tactics, maintaining low altitude to avoid detection by American radar systems until the final attack phase, when the aircraft would climb to diving altitude and begin their terminal runs against selected targets. The 6 aircraft were flying in a loose formation that would allow individual pilots to select separate targets or concentrate their attacks against a single high-value vessel, depending on the tactical situation they encountered. Intelligence reports indicated that recent kamikaze formations had included a mixture of aircraft types, from obsolete training planes converted for suicide missions to frontline fighters and bombers flown by experienced pilots who had volunteered for one-way missions against American naval forces. The Combat Information Center aboard the USS Maynard L. Able represented the technological pinnacle of American naval warfare in 1945, equipped with radar systems, radio communications equipment, and plotting boards that allowed the ship's officers to track multiple targets simultaneously while coordinating defensive fires and fighter aircraft support. Lieutenant Commander James Westholm, the destroyer's executive officer, supervised the CIC team as they prepared to guide combat air patrol fighters toward the incoming kamikaze formation while simultaneously calculating firing solutions for the ship's anti-aircraft guns. But the mathematics of the tactical situation admitted no optimistic interpretations. 6 suicide aircraft attacking a single destroyer presented odds that had proven catastrophic for numerous American vessels during the Okinawa campaign. Captain DeGrasse's immediate response to the radar contact reflected standard operating procedures developed through months of experience with kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa operation. He ordered the ship to general quarters, bringing all weapon systems to full readiness while requesting immediate fighter support from the Combat Air Patrol maintained by Task Force 58's carrier groups. The destroyer's 5-inch guns were loaded with VT-fused anti-aircraft rounds designed to explode in proximity to enemy aircraft, while the 40mm and 20mm guns were prepared for close-range engagement of any aircraft that penetrated the ship's outer defensive fire zone. The request for Combat Air Patrol support revealed one of the fundamental weaknesses in the radar picket system employed by American forces during the Okinawa campaign. Individual destroyers operating at extended distances from the main body of naval forces often found themselves beyond the effective range of fighter aircraft, or competing with higher priority targets for limited CAP resources. Radio communications with Task Force 58's fighter direction centers indicated that 4 F-6F Hellcat fighters were being vectored toward the USS Maynard L. Able's position, but their estimated time of arrival was 18 minutes, while the incoming kamikaze formation would reach attack range in approximately 12 minutes. Morrison's continued radar tracking painted an increasingly ominous picture of the developing attack as the Japanese formation approached to within 25 miles of the destroyer's position. The aircraft had separated into 2 groups of 3 planes each, with one group maintaining a direct approach toward the USS Maynard L. Able, while the second group executed a flanking maneuver that would bring them to attack position from a different bearing. This tactical modification indicated that the kamikaze pilots were experienced aviators capable of coordinating their attacks to maximize the probability of successful strikes against their target, rather than simply flying individual suicide missions without regard for mutual support. The crew of the USS Maynard L. Able had experienced kamikaze attacks on 7 previous occasions during their deployment to the Western Pacific, losing 11 men killed and 23 wounded during engagements that had tested the limits of human endurance and mechanical reliability. Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Patterson, responsible for the destroyer's forward 5-inch gun mount, had participated in every anti-aircraft engagement since the ship's arrival at Okinawa, developing an intuitive understanding of kamikaze tactics and the split-second timing required for effective defensive fire. But Patterson also understood that previous survival had been largely a matter of luck and numerical odds that could not be expected to continue indefinitely. The 40mm Bofors guns mounted aboard the USS Maynard L. Able represented some of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons available to American naval forces in 1945, capable of firing 120 rounds per minute with sufficient accuracy and destructive power to destroy incoming aircraft at ranges up to 5,000 yards. Gun Captain Petty Officer 2nd Class Vincent Sapienza had trained his crew to achieve firing rates that exceeded the weapon's theoretical maximum, but effectiveness against kamikaze attacks depended on early target acquisition and sustained accurate fire that became increasingly difficult as multiple aircraft attacked simultaneously from different directions. At 1,347 hours, Morrison's radar contact gained visual confirmation when lookouts in the destroyer's superstructure spotted the first group of Japanese aircraft as small dark specks against the western sky, approaching at low altitude with the distinctive high-speed profile that characterized suicide attack formations. The aircraft were identified as Nakajima B-6N Tenzin torpedo bombers, known to American forces by the code name JIL, single-engine aircraft capable of carrying 800-kilogram bombs, or modified with additional fuel tanks to extend their range for one-way missions against distant targets. The sight of incoming kamikaze aircraft triggered an immediate physiological response among the destroyer's crew, as men who had survived previous attacks experienced the combination of fear, determination, and desperate hope that characterized naval combat against suicide weapons. Captain DeGrasse's tactical assessment of the situation led him to order maximum speed and radical maneuvering designed to complicate the kamikaze pilots' attack approaches while providing optimal firing positions for his ship's anti-aircraft guns. The USS Maynard L. Able accelerated to flank speed of 38 knots while executing a series of sharp turns that created a confused wake pattern and made precise bombing calculations nearly impossible. But the destroyer's maneuvering was constrained by her assigned position on Radar Picket Station 14, which required her to remain within a relatively small geographic area to maintain effective radar coverage of the approaches to Okinawa. The first group of 3 kamikaze aircraft began their terminal attack runs at 1,351 hours, diving from an altitude of 3,000 feet toward the maneuvering destroyer with a combination of tactical skill and suicidal determination that reflected months of specialized training. The lead aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Saburo Dohei of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 721st Air Group, had selected the USS Maynard L. Able as his target after observing her isolated position and recognizing the tactical significance of destroying a radar picket vessel that provided early warning for American carrier forces. Dohei's two wingmen, flying Petty Officers Hiroshi Tanaka and Kenji Yamamoto, would coordinate their attacks to overwhelm the destroyer's defensive fires through simultaneous approaches from different bearings. The destroyer's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, with VT-fused shells creating a barrage of airbursts designed to destroy incoming aircraft before they could reach attack range. The distinctive crack of 5-inch gun mounts firing in rapid succession mixed with the deeper rumble of 40mm Bofors guns and the sharp staccato of 20mm Oerlikon cannons as the USS Maynard L. Able's anti-aircraft battery engaged multiple targets simultaneously. Tracer rounds created brilliant streams of light that crisscrossed the sky above the destroyer, while shell bursts marked the positions where proximity-fused rounds detonated near Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Dohei's Kamikaze aircraft absorbed multiple hits from 20mm cannon fire as it dove toward the destroyer's bridge superstructure, with armor-piercing rounds punching holes through the aircraft's engine cowling and wing structures. But the Nakajima B-6N's rugged construction and the pilot's determination to complete his suicide mission allowed the damaged aircraft to continue its attack run despite mechanical failures and control problems caused by battle damage. The aircraft's 800-kilogram bomb represented sufficient explosive power to sink or severely damage a Fletcher-class destroyer if detonated against the ship's hull or critical systems. Patterson's forward 5-inch gun mount achieved a direct hit on flying Petty Officer Tanaka's aircraft at a range of 1,200 yards, with a VT-fused shell detonating within lethal proximity of the Kamikaze plane's cockpit. The explosion killed the pilot instantly and sent the aircraft tumbling out of control into the ocean 50 yards off the destroyer's starboard beam, where its bomb detonated underwater with sufficient force to shower the USS Maynard L. Able's deck with fragments of metal and seawater. The destruction of one Kamikaze aircraft demonstrated the effectiveness of American anti-aircraft defenses when properly coordinated, but two enemy planes remained in attack position with sufficient time and distance to complete their suicide missions. Flying Petty Officer Yamamoto's aircraft approached the destroyer from a different bearing, using the ship's superstructure to mask his approach until the final seconds of his attack run. The Kamikaze plane's low-altitude approach carried it beneath the effective engagement envelope of the destroyer's 5-inch guns, allowing the aircraft to close to point-blank range before 40mm and 20mm weapons could achieve sufficient hits to disable the attacking plane. Yamamoto's tactical skill in timing his approach and selecting his aim point reflected training that had prepared him specifically for suicide attacks against American naval vessels. The collision between flying Petty Officer Yamamoto's aircraft and the USS Maynard L. Able occurred at 1,354 hours when the Kamikaze plane struck the destroyer's after-deckhouse at a shallow angle, with the aircraft's 800-kilogram bomb penetrating the ship's hull before detonating in the after-engine room. The explosion killed 14 men instantly and ruptured the destroyer's main steam lines, causing immediate loss of propulsion and electrical power throughout the ship. Seawater flooded through the massive hole torn in the hull by the bomb blast, and the USS Maynard L. Able began settling by the stern as her damage control parties struggled to contain flooding and restore essential systems. Lieutenant Dohei's aircraft completed the destruction of the USS Maynard L. Able when his Kamikaze plane struck the destroyer amidships at 1,355 hours, with the impact and subsequent bomb explosion breaking the ship's keel and causing catastrophic structural failure. The 2,200-ton destroyer broke apart and sank within 5 minutes of the second Kamikaze hit, taking 84 officers and enlisted men to the bottom of the East China Sea, while 189 survivors struggled in the oil-contaminated water waiting for rescue by other American vessels. The destruction of the radar picket destroyer eliminated a crucial early warning station and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated kamikaze attacks against isolated naval targets. Morrison had remained at his radar console throughout the kamikaze attack, providing target tracking information to the ship's gun directors until the moment when flying Petty Officer Yamamoto's aircraft struck the destroyer's superstructure. The young radarman died at his post, along with 13 other men in the Combat Information Center, when the kamikaze plane's bomb detonated directly beneath their battle station. Morrison's dedication to duty exemplified the courage and professionalism displayed by thousands of American sailors who faced suicide attacks during the Okinawa campaign while continuing to perform their assigned missions despite the constant threat of death. The combat air patrol fighters vectored to assist the USS L. Able arrived at her last known position 6 minutes after the destroyer had sunk, finding only scattered debris and survivors in life rafts marking the location where the ship had fought her final battle. The 4 F-6F Hellcat fighters conducted a search for additional Japanese aircraft while radioing for rescue vessels to recover survivors from the water. The fighters' late arrival reflected the tactical reality that radar picket destroyers often operated beyond the effective range of immediate fighter support, making them vulnerable to concentrated kamikaze attacks that could overwhelm individual ship defenses. Captain de Grasse survived the sinking of his command and was recovered from the water by the destroyer escort USS Richard W. Susans approximately 90 minutes after the USS L. Able had been destroyed. His after-action report provided detailed analysis of kamikaze tactics and recommendations for improved defensive measures, but acknowledged that the fundamental problem facing radar picket vessels was their isolated operating positions that prevented mutual defensive support between ships. The report concluded that individual destroyers, regardless of their armament and crew training, could not reliably defend against coordinated suicide attacks by multiple aircraft. The 3 remaining kamikaze aircraft from the second group of attackers had observed the destruction of the USS L. Able from a distance while maneuvering to attack other American vessels in the area. These aircraft, piloted by experienced naval aviators who had volunteered for suicide missions, continued their search for targets until they located the destroyer USS Stanley operating on a nearby radar picket station. The subsequent attack on the USS Stanley resulted in additional American casualties and demonstrated that the kamikaze threat remained active even after individual ships had been destroyed. Intelligence analysis of the kamikaze attack that destroyed the USS L. Able revealed that the 6 Japanese aircraft had originated from airfields on Kyushu Island as part of a larger coordinated operation involving more than 150 suicide planes directed against American naval forces supporting the Okinawa invasion. The attack represented a tactical success for Japanese forces, eliminating a radar picket station and reducing American early warning capabilities while achieving a favorable exchange ratio from the Japanese perspective. The loss of 6 aircraft and pilots in exchange for a 2,200-ton destroyer and 84 American casualties was considered acceptable by Japanese commanders who viewed kamikaze operations as the most effective means of inflicting damage on superior American naval forces. The destruction of radar picket destroyers like the USS L. Able created gaps in the early warning network that protected American carrier forces from surprise air attacks, requiring constant repositioning of other vessels to maintain adequate radar coverage. Task Force 58's operations during the Okinawa campaign were significantly complicated by the loss of radar picket stations, as carriers and battleships were forced to operate closer to the combat zone to provide their own early warning rather than relying on advanced destroyer stations. The cumulative effect of kamikaze attacks against radar picket vessels degraded American operational flexibility and increased the vulnerability of high-value targets to Japanese air attacks. Damage control procedures aboard American destroyers had been refined through months of experience with kamikaze attacks, but the USS L. Able's rapid sinking demonstrated that even the most advanced damage control techniques could not prevent ship loss when suicide aircraft achieved direct hits with large bombs. The Fletcher-class destroyer's construction incorporated multiple watertight compartments and redundant systems designed to maintain buoyancy and essential functions after battle damage, but coordinated kamikaze attacks that caused multiple simultaneous hull breaches exceeded the ship's damage survival capabilities. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks on American naval personnel during the Okinawa campaign created stress-related casualties that often exceeded the numbers of men killed or wounded by enemy action. Survivors of ships like the USS L. Able frequently exhibited symptoms of combat fatigue, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress that affected their ability to perform duties aboard subsequent assignments. Medical personnel aboard American vessels reported increasing numbers of psychosomatic illnesses and behavioral problems among crew members who had experienced repeated kamikaze attacks during extended combat deployments. The tactical lessons learned from the destruction of the USS L. Able were incorporated into American naval doctrine and training programs, emphasizing the importance of coordinated defensive fires, fighter direction procedures, and damage control techniques optimized for kamikaze defense. The engagement demonstrated that individual destroyers required fighter support to survive concentrated suicide attacks, leading to modifications in radar picket station assignments that provided multiple ships and dedicated combat air patrol support for early warning operations. Japanese military records captured after the war revealed that the kamikaze pilots who attacked the USS Able were volunteers from regular naval aviation units who had received specialized training in suicide attack techniques at bases on Kyushu Island. Lieutenant Dohee and his fellow pilots were experienced aviators with combat records dating back to the early years of the Pacific War, representing a significant investment in training and experience that the Japanese military was willing to sacrifice in suicide attacks against American naval targets. The loss of the USS Able was officially announced to the families of her crew members through standard Navy Department telegrams that provided minimal details about the circumstances of the ship's destruction. Wartime censorship prevented publication of specific information about kamikaze attacks or their effectiveness against American naval forces, but families gradually learned the details of their loved ones' deaths through letters from survivors and unofficial communications from other crew members. Memorial services for the crew of the USS Able were conducted aboard other ships of Task Force 58, with Captain DeGrasse and other survivors participating in ceremonies that honored the 84 men who had died when their ship was destroyed by kamikaze attacks. The services emphasized the crew's dedication to duty and their sacrifice in defense of American forces conducting the invasion of Okinawa, while acknowledging the particular courage required to serve aboard radar picket vessels that faced constant threats from suicide aircraft. The wreckage of the USS Able lies in approximately 200 fathoms of water 65 nautical miles northwest of Okinawa, where the destroyer sank on April 12, 1945, after being struck by 2 kamikaze aircraft. The ship's remains have been located by marine archaeologists and designated as a war grave protected under international maritime law, with access restricted to preserve the site as a memorial to the men who died during the engagement. Periodic expeditions to the wreck site have recovered artifacts and documented the destroyer's final condition, providing insight into the damage caused by kamikaze attacks. Post-war analysis of American casualties during the Okinawa campaign revealed that naval forces suffered higher losses than ground troops, primarily due to the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks against ships operating in support of the invasion. The destruction of vessels like the USS Able represented individual tragedies within a larger strategic context, as American forces ultimately achieved their objective of capturing Okinawa despite significant losses to suicide attacks. The campaign demonstrated both the tactical effectiveness of kamikaze weapons and their ultimate strategic failure to prevent American victory. The radar equipment that Morrison had operated aboard the USS Able represented cutting-edge technology that provided American naval forces with significant advantages in detecting and tracking enemy aircraft, but radar systems could not prevent determined suicide attacks once kamikaze planes approached within visual range of their targets. The destroyer's SG surface search radar and SK air search radar provided excellent early warning capabilities, but the effectiveness of these systems depended on having sufficient time and defensive firepower to engage detected threats before they could complete their attacks. Captain DeGrasse's post-war career included assignments that utilized his experience with kamikaze defense, as the Navy incorporated lessons learned from engagements like the USS Able's final battle into training programs and tactical doctrine for future operations. His recommendations for improved fighter direction procedures and coordinated defensive measures influenced the development of integrated air defense systems that became standard in post-war naval operations. The captain's survival and subsequent service ensured that the tactical knowledge gained through his ship's destruction contributed to improved defensive capabilities for other vessels. The families of kamikaze pilots who participated in the attack against the USS Able received notification of their deaths through standard Japanese military procedures, but were provided with no details about the specific missions or their outcomes. Post-war research has identified the individual pilots and their backgrounds, revealing that men like Lieutenant Dohee were experienced naval aviators who had volunteered for suicide missions after concluding that conventional attacks offered little chance of success against superior American forces. Modern naval warfare has evolved far beyond the technology and tactics that characterize the engagement between kamikaze aircraft and the USS Maynard L. Able, but the fundamental challenge of defending ships against suicide attacks remains relevant to contemporary military planning. The destroyer's destruction demonstrated that even well-armed and professionally crewed vessels remain vulnerable to determined attackers willing to sacrifice their lives to achieve tactical objectives, a lesson that continues to influence naval defensive doctrine and ship design philosophy. The site where the USS Maynard L. Able fought her final battle shows no trace of the violence that occurred there on April 12, 1945, as the Pacific Ocean continues its eternal cycle above the destroyer's wreck. Commercial shipping passes over the area without marking the spot where 84 American sailors died defending their ship against kamikaze attacks. But their sacrifice is remembered in naval tradition and military history as an example of courage and dedication under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The tactical significance of radar picket destroyers during the Okinawa campaign extended far beyond their individual combat capabilities, as these vessels provided the early warning network that allowed American carrier forces to maintain air superiority despite concentrated Japanese suicide attacks. The destruction of ships like the USS Maynard L. Able degraded this defensive system and required constant adaptation of American tactics to maintain effective protection for high-value targets. The mathematical reality of kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign demonstrated that individual destroyers, regardless of their armament and crew training, could not reliably survive concentrated suicide attacks by multiple aircraft. The USS Maynard L. Able's destruction occurred despite having experienced crew members, modern anti-aircraft weapons, and advance warning of the incoming attack, illustrating the fundamental vulnerability of isolated naval vessels to coordinated kamikaze operations. American industrial production capabilities allowed rapid replacement of destroyers lost to kamikaze attacks, but the experienced crews of vessels like the USS Maynard L. Able could not be replaced as easily. The loss of trained radar operators, gun crews, and officers represented a significant degradation of American naval capabilities that affected operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Training replacement personnel to the standards achieved by veteran crews required months of instruction and combat experience that could not be accelerated despite urgent operational requirements. The courage displayed by the crew of the USS Maynard L. Able during their final battle exemplified the fighting spirit of American naval personnel during World War II, as men continued to perform their duties despite knowing that kamikaze attacks offered little chance of survival for the crews of targeted vessels. The destroyer's anti-aircraft gunners maintained effective fire until their weapons were destroyed by enemy bombs, while damage control parties attempted to save their ship even after suffering catastrophic battle damage. The legacy of the USS Maynard L. Able and her crew lives on in American naval tradition, where the destroyer's final battle is remembered as an example of professional competence and personal courage under combat conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The ship's destruction during kamikaze attacks near Okinawa represents one of thousands of individual sacrifices that contributed to ultimate American victory in the Pacific War, demonstrating the cumulative effect of personal courage and dedication to duty in achieving strategic objectives. Combat air patrol procedures developed during the Okinawa campaign were significantly influenced by experiences like the USS Maynard L. Able's final battle, as American commanders recognized that radar picket vessels required dedicated fighter support to survive concentrated kamikaze attacks. The destroyer's destruction occurred partly because combat air patrol aircraft arrived too late to intercept attacking Japanese planes, leading to modifications in fighter direction procedures that provided closer coordination between surface vessels and protective aircraft. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks against radar picket destroyers created tactical dilemmas for American commanders who needed early warning capabilities but could not afford to lose ships and crews at unsustainable rates. The solution involved deploying multiple vessels at each radar picket station, providing mutual defensive support while maintaining adequate radar coverage of approaches to American naval formations. This modification reduced individual ship vulnerability but required additional destroyers that were needed for other operational requirements. The destruction of the USS Maynard L. Able on April 12, 1945, occurred during one of the most intense periods of kamikaze activity during the Okinawa campaign, as Japanese forces conducted coordinated suicide attacks designed to inflict maximum casualties on American naval forces supporting the invasion. The destroyer's loss was part of a larger pattern of Japanese tactical success that achieved significant damage to American vessels while failing to prevent ultimate strategic defeat. Historical analysis of the engagement reveals that the USS Maynard L. Able's crew performed their duties with exceptional competence and courage, achieving the destruction of one kamikaze aircraft and inflicting damage on others before being overwhelmed by coordinated suicide attacks. The destroyer's anti-aircraft defenses functioned as designed, but the mathematical odds of 6 aircraft attacking a single vessel exceeded the ship's defensive capabilities despite optimal crew performance and equipment reliability. The memory of Morrison and his fellow radarmen who died at their posts aboard vessels like the USS Maynard L. Able continues to inspire naval personnel responsible for operating detection and tracking equipment that provides early warning of enemy threats. Their dedication to duty despite knowing that radar picket stations were primary targets for kamikaze attacks exemplifies the professional standards that characterize American naval service during both wartime and peacetime operations. The tactical innovations developed in response to kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign influenced post-war naval doctrine and contributed to the development of integrated air defense systems that became standard aboard American warships. The lessons learned from engagements like the USS Maynard L. Able's final battle provided the foundation for defensive measures that proved essential during subsequent conflicts involving asymmetric threats and suicide attacks against naval forces. The 189 survivors of the USS Maynard L. Able's destruction were recovered from the water by rescue vessels that arrived within hours of the destroyer's sinking, demonstrating the effectiveness of search and rescue procedures developed during months of combat operations near Okinawa. The men who survived the kamikaze attacks and subsequent sinking provided detailed accounts of the engagement that contributed to improvements in ship design, damage control procedures, and anti-aircraft defensive tactics. The East China Sea continues its eternal flow above the wreck of the USS Maynard L. Able, indifferent to the human drama that played out on its surface more than 75 years ago. The destroyers serve as an underwater memorial to the courage and sacrifice of American naval personnel who faced kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign, while the lessons learned from their final battle continue to influence military planning and naval defensive doctrine around the world.